When the Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the church in Galatia, he was writing to a church in crisis. Now, they may not have known that they were in crisis, but from where Paul sits, and you get a sense from his tone that he thinks they're in crisis. And he thinks they're in crisis because they are at risk. And they are at risk of compromising what Paul understands, what we would understand, to be absolutely fundamental, absolutely basic. Like, this is the core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And they were at risk of compromising that, of betraying it, of misrepresenting it, or even worse, of perverting it. You might say, well, what is this thing? What's this fundamental thing that Paul is concerned about and the Galatians apparently are neglecting or rejecting or something like that? And Paul's answer is, it's the gospel, the good news, the message about the Lord Jesus Christ. And for Paul, this is something on which the church stands or falls. If you have this, you have one of the basic elements of church, and if you don't, you're not a church, as far as Galatians is concerned. To be super clear, the word gospel is used in different ways in the New Testament or in Christian language. Sometimes we talk about the Gospels, plural, and that's the 4 books at the beginning of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Sometimes we talk about the gospel, singular, and we're talking not about a book in the New Testament, but really the proclamation that makes up the central claims of the New Testament as a whole, and really the Bible. This message about Jesus, about his death, about his resurrection, about his ascension into to the throne of heaven, which is about his lordship, his death, his resurrection, his lordship, and all of that together is good news about Jesus, our King, and it is itself a call to faith, to trust him. So that's the issue in this letter. And we're going to see as we read through it that's the issue again and again and again. All of the different things that he deals with, and he kind of spans some different things, boil down to this one thing, which is helpful for us. Because it means that the gospel, if we get this right, if we get the gospel right, then it's applicable. It helps us with everything else in all of life. So if you're looking for one thing that will help you with everything, Galatians says, look at the gospel. Look at the gospel. The good news about Jesus, his death, his resurrection, his lordship, his perfect love for us. Look at the gospel. So that's our message. We're going to dig into that. We're going to see the content. We're going to see the implications. For now, Paul is worried about false gospels or perversions of the gospel. And if that's his central concern that begins to come to the surface in this text, maybe we can put it this way. Any gospel that's not the one gospel is no gospel at all. For Paul, for us, for the church, any gospel that's not the one gospel is no gospel at all. Now, how big of a deal is this? You may have noticed that Paul uses some pretty strong language in these opening verses of Galatians. You might at times think you'd like to know Paul and get to know him a little bit, but you sure don't want to be on his bad side, do you? Because this guy, when he thought there was a problem, didn't mince words. He was happy to kind of let you know that he's not happy with what you're doing. So he uses this incredibly strong language. He's got this big tone, and that big tone says, hey, this is a big deal. And this isn't one of those things where, the Jewish Christians can do this and the Gentile Christians can do that, and we can still get along. Like, this is a crucial, the church stands or the church falls in this place. And that strong language emphasizes how crucial gospel focus, gospel clarity, and gospel devotion are. Let's listen to some of his language. He says in verse 6, I am astonished. Astonished. I can't believe it. I'm blown away. I'm taken aback. I'm surprised. I am astonished. Well, what are you astonished about, Paul? You can imagine the Galatians asking. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. Right? I have been there and ministered to you and cared for you and preached the gospel to you, and God was at work in that proclamation of the gospel, and that one God has called you and brought you to himself. And it hasn't been that long ago, and there was initial fruit, and we were excited about that, and you loved the gospel, but now how quickly you are turning from it, how quickly you are deserting it. So Paul's got this stunning, emphatic language that he is just absolutely stunned that this quickly, like he's proclaimed the good news to them with clarity, and how quickly they've turned from it. Verse 7, you get another sense of his astonishment, where he almost sounds a bit sarcastic, as if there is another gospel. Right? You've clearly received the one gospel, but now you're doing things that conflict with it, as if there's some other rule or standard, as if there's some other gospel, as if there's some other good news about Jesus. And for Paul, there's a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. Best case scenario with this false gospel is that they're just confused. Like they're just mixed up. They just need to sort some things out. Worst case scenario is that the gospel's been perverted. That there is intentional, malicious perversion of the good news of Jesus happening in their midst. And so he tells them, like, there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So for the Galatians at least, he's willing to say, I think you're just a little mixed up. It's a big deal. I'm astonished. But you seem to be a little mixed up. There's some other people who are more malicious, and they have perverted the gospel. They should know better. You ever find yourself saying that? You should know better. They should know better, Paul says. But they've propagated this false gospel. They've perverted the truth. And you're being taken in. And this big tone, this aggressive language, this big posture that he takes on is meant to emphasize the reality that they could move from simple confusion to perversion. Like this could get worse for them. And he's writing to them to try to keep that from happening. Now, as the letter goes on, we'll find out more about these people who are confusing them. We don't get a lot of detail here, so we're not going to dig into that just yet. We'll have more time for that later on. The point is to see that the Galatians are they're getting a message from Paul, and they're getting a message from somebody else. They're kind of mixed up, and Paul wants to make sure that they don't go from confusion to abject, malicious perversion of the gospel. One more clue in the text tells us how seriously Paul takes this. It's one of those things where if we miss this, we must not be paying attention at all. Because we don't hear this kind of language that much in Paul specifically or in the Bible in general, but it shows up in some places. Even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be, did you catch that word? Cursed. So let's just run some hypotheticals, Paul says. Let's just imagine somebody from my ministry team shows up. And we had the original gospel, the true gospel that we proclaim, Jesus dead, resurrected, and exalted. Somebody from our team comes back and preaches a contrary gospel. That's serious enough for me to say, let them be accursed. Let's run another hypothetical, Paul says. Let's say an angel from heaven shows up. Preaches a different gospel. And you might be tempted to take it as a credible, trustworthy message. After all, it's an angel from heaven. Paul says the gospel is the standard, not the bearer of the gospel. You see the difference there? The message is the standard, not the one bringing the message. So even if it's an angel from heaven, if the message is wrong, that angel is a demon. Fallen angel. Let that one be accursed. So the focus for Paul isn't on the bearer of the message. The focus is on the content of the message. And you might have somebody come along who's a real sweet talker, a real schmoozer, kind of thinking, set it out there real nice, and it sounds real believable. Paul says, be careful. You know the truth. Anybody who strays from that, this is a big enough deal for me not to simply say, well, let's work on that, or, well, let's try to straighten that out. No, he says straight up, let that one be cursed. Cut, and by cursed he means like cut off from Jesus. Big tone means this is a big deal. Big language means this is a big deal. For Paul, the thing we learn is that the gospel is a make it or break it issue. The gospel is a make it or break it issue. Without the gospel, we are not Christians. Without the gospel, we are not a church. Our primary, singular, first thing is the clear commitment and proclamation of the good news that the crucified Jesus has been resurrected and exalted to the throne of heaven. And he welcomes all who come with faith and a desire to follow him. That's the bare minimum to qualify as a church. There are other things, proclamation of the word, the administration of the sacraments, but if we don't get the gospel right, we don't ever get to those. No gospel for Paul, no church. Which is why it's good for Christians, good for us, to frequently, regularly refresh ourselves, recommit ourselves, renew ourselves. And on this first day of the year, to turn our attention to this one thing that matters more than anything. The gospel governs our identity. It defines our identity. It governs our practices. And it ought to permeate everything we do. This is one reason every sermon you hear has the gospel somewhere. Every sermon you hear has the gospel somewhere. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, if there's no gospel, it's not actually a sermon. It might be a motivational speech. It might be a spiritual reflection. No gospel, no sermon. No gospel, no means of grace. No gospel, no power of the Holy Spirit to convict and convert and transform and forgive and renew and justify and sanctify. No gospel, no Jesus.